This is the Toyota 4Runner TRD Pro, and it is one of the coolest SUVs on sale. I mean it. Just look at this thing. It just is. It's cool, and I'm cooler for standing next to it. There's only one problem, though. It costs almost $50,000 for a mid-size Toyota SUV. Today, I'm going to show you why. I've borrowed this TRD Pro from a viewer here in the Philadelphia suburbs, and today I'm going to take you on a tour of it. But first, a little background. Now, if you're not familiar with Toyota's SUV lineup here in North America, there's a small one, the RAV4, there's a mid-size one, the Highlander, there's a large one, the Sequoia, and then there's a really large one, the Land Cruiser. Somewhere in the middle is this, the 4Runner, which is the same size as the Highlander, except it's less efficient, worse to drive, less practical, and more expensive. And yet, we love it. Even in an era of crossovers and more crossovers and car-like driving experiences and SUVs and environmental responsibility, the 4Runner is a success. This is one of the last few body-on-frame SUVs left. It gets only 18 miles per gallon in combined city and highway driving, and it's tremendously old school, as I will show you. But last year was its best sales year ever. Toyota sold 128,000 of these, which means the 4Runner outsold the Lexus RX. Think about that. The 4Runner outsold the Lexus RX. That's especially surprising because there was a time when we all thought the 4Runner was doomed. The 4Runner came out in the 1980s, and it's gone through various generations over the years, but in 2009, Toyota sold only 19,000 of these. The economy was bad, fuel prices were high, SUVs were not in high demand, and frankly, I thought they were going to kill off the 4Runner. In fact, Nissan recently canceled the Xterra, which was one of the few competitors to this car, but since then, the economy has been booming, and the 4Runner's popularity has taken off. And that brings us to the TRD Pro version. Spurred by the success of the Ford Raptor, Toyota has been introducing off-roader TRD Pro versions of several of its vehicles. There's the Tacoma TRD Pro midsize pickup and the Tundra TRD Pro full-size pickup, but I happen to think the 4Runner TRD Pro is the coolest of them all, and this is the coolest color. So today, I'm going to take you on a tour of it, and I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of the 4Runner TRD Pro, and then I'm going to get behind the wheel and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the 4Runner TRD Pro, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of all the 4Runner generations ranked from best to worst in my opinion. Now, I'm going to start by covering a few ways that the 4Runner, despite its almost $50,000 price tag, is bizarrely old-fashioned. And that means starting under the hood with the engine, this is a 4-liter V6. No turbocharging, no supercharging, no attempt to really get better fuel economy than it does. It's made it to an old-school 5-speed automatic. It's durable, but it isn't exactly efficient. That's where that 18 mile per gallon fuel economy rating comes from. The other thing I find really funny under the hood, this car has a plastic engine cover, just like basically every car, and you notice there are 6 little circles on the top of the engine cover, apparently to let you know that this is a 6-cylinder vehicle. Now, it's not uncommon for the engine cover to have little circles or dots kind of letting you know where the cylinders are, but if you look under the little circles on this one, you'll notice they don't go to anything. They're just like decorative circles letting you know that you have a V6, which I find kind of funny. What I think Toyota ought to do is, because these circles are obviously decorative, instead of 6, why not do 8? So people are showing off their 4 to their friends, they pop open the hood, look at the plastic engine cover. Yeah, I got a V8 4Runner. Yeah, it's a V8 4Runner. Hell, why stop at 8? Go for 10! You could be telling people you got a V10 4Runner. And then we move on to another old school item up front, and that would be the headlights. You pay almost 50 grand for this truck, and you get halogen headlights. I'm serious. Almost 50 grand for halogens. The owner of this particular truck was so disgusted by that, he replaced them with high intensity lights so he could see at night in his $50,000 4Runner. Next up, we move on to getting into the 4Runner, and this has to be one of the most expensive cars left that is still using a traditional key. And actually, it gets worse than that. It's not just a traditional key, but there's no thing where you can just walk up and tap the door handle and get right in, even though the RAV4 has that for like half the money. The 4Runner doesn't. And because it's a traditional key, once you get inside, there's no push button. You have to take the key out of your pocket, you have to insert it into the ignition tumbler and twist it in order to turn the car on. But the way you can most tell it's old school is when you get inside and you look at the gauge cluster. Now, most high-end cars have gone to full screens for their gauge clusters, no more dials. Lower-end cars mostly haven't, and that's fine. But even they have largely gone to full-color LCD screens between the gauges. This thing isn't there yet. Instead, it's still using this ancient looking black and white screen with about 19 pixels in the display. Look at some of these screens it's displaying. A lot of other cars will show you all sorts of menus and settings and information in here. The 4Runner will not, although I do like the graphic when the door is open. It sort of shows those cute little tires in front and reminds you that you're driving a car that came out in what appears to be 1999. It's the same story if you go into the infotainment screen. Look at how small this screen is in a $50,000 vehicle. In fact, you can hold my phone up next to it and they're the same size. So basically you're driving around in this thing and you have nothing better than a phone on a mount hanging from the windshield. And take a look at the backup camera. You put it in reverse and that is all the backup camera you get. There's no 360 camera, there's no parking sensors, nothing like that. You just get a phone-sized screen to make sure you don't back over anything. And speaking of screens and displays, take a look at the clock. The clock is still one of these old school clocks that looks like a 1980s clock radio with the H and M buttons kind of sticking out from the clock so you can manually adjust it very easily. And of course, it's not just fuel efficiency and old school design. This car is also really low on equipment you'd expect from a $50,000 car. For instance, there's no blind spot monitor in this car. Basically, everybody has that now. There's no forward collision warning. There's no automatic braking, adaptive cruise control. You can't get any of that stuff in the 4Runner, no matter how much you spend. Also, another old-fashioned item in this truck, when you turn it on, take a look, the four-wheel drive shift lever kind of shakes around a little bit. Everybody else has moved to buttons or switches to turn on four-wheel drive, but Toyota is still using an old-school lever, and it shakes like a Harley sitting at a stoplight every time you turn on the truck. But then again, that isn't really that big of a deal, because if you complain about how old-fashioned this truck is, you're kind of missing the point. That's why people buy it, because it's simple, because there's no keyless entry system that can brake. There's no blind spot monitor that can brake. The screen isn't some huge thing that integrates every function. It's a simple old-fashioned vehicle you can take off-roading without having to worry about all sorts of electronics braking. That's the point of the 4Runner, and a lot of people seem to be into it. And so we move on to covering some of the other interesting quirks. I'm going to start with the floor mats. Now, do you remember a couple of years ago when Toyota had that issue where the floor mats were causing the accelerator pedals to stick, and so they had to recall like every car they ever made? Well, they're still selling these rubber floor mats, but boy, have they gotten a lot more serious about it. There are no fewer than 3 giant warning labels on this particular floor mat. The first one reads, "Driver's side, install mat securely with clips." And then there are these giant clips to make sure it doesn't slip or slide away. The next one says, "Do not place on top of existing mats." That was a problem they were having. People were putting them on top of the existing floor mats. Well, now there's a giant warning label letting you know not to do that. And then there's one more warning label that says "front of vehicle" at the top of the mat, so you know exactly which way you're supposed to place it. These warning labels are absolutely massive, and they sort of cut into the design of the mat. They certainly don't make it look as cool when you look down and see a lot of warning labels in 3 different languages, but Toyota is clearly taking no chances with floor mats anymore. Next up, moving on to the rest of the interior quirks, I'm going to start with the driver's door panel, where this car has one of the strangest window lockouts I've ever seen. Just like all cars, if you want to lock out your passengers from rolling down the windows, you press a little button and then they can't do it anymore. If, for example, your kids are rolling down and up the windows and annoying you. The weird thing about this one is when you lock out the windows, you also lock yourself in the driver's seat from rolling down the windows. So you can roll down your driver window even with the windows locked, but you can't even roll down any of the other windows. Next up, moving into the center console area, one interesting thing about this vehicle, despite all those old-fashioned touches, it does have heated seats, and they're not just heated seats, but they're like infinite adjustment heated seats. Most cars have an on or off. This car has a little slider, and so you can turn it to exactly the amount of heat that you want to come out of your heated seats. No, that's not enough. A little bit more, a little bit more, a little less. It's very strange to see. In almost every other car, it's like on, off, or a little dial, maybe 1, 2, 3, but in this car, you can adjust the exact amount of heat you want on your butt. Next up, we move on to the center control stack, and in keeping with this truck's rough, tough guy image, it has this giant, square, massive, right-angled center control stack with just angles and cuts everywhere. This isn't one of those flowy ones that you see in almost every other luxury car. One interesting item, especially about the center stack, is the size of the climate control buttons. There's a lot of climate control dials, but the buttons it does have are massive. Seriously, there's like 3 square inches of button here, like the size of one of the properties on the Monopoly game board, and when you press them, a little light lights up, letting you know that you have done your button pressing work. Next up, moving on to the overhead center console. This car has a bunch of really cool off-roader features, which I'll get to in a little bit. My personal favorite is the multi-terrain select dial. You can select basically what terrain you're on, and when you do, it shows up in that old school black and white gauge cluster display. You can do rock, you can do loose rock, you can do mogul, if you're driving over moguls, and then you can do mud, sand, dirt. Another thing I like up here is the home link. That's the garage door opener you can program, so you don't have to keep your garage door opener in the vehicle. You can just push a button and then get into your garage door. There's one for 1, 2, and 3 if you have 3 different garage doors. Now, interestingly, the buttons have little dots on them. 1 dot on the 1, 2 dots on the 2, 3 dots on the 3. So if you're driving home, you don't have to look up there. You can just sort of feel up there and press the garage door opener. Next up, moving on to the window sticker. Now, the sticker price on this TRD Pro is just a shade under $45,000, but there are more options and extras that you can get that this one doesn't have. This one, for instance, doesn't even have a sunroof. One interesting item is some of the things they do charge for. For example, 50 state emissions is extra. It's $185 extra. Could you ask for like 37 state emissions? 12 state emissions? I only really need to use the car in about 6 states. I'll pay you $12 for that. Next up, we move on to the sun visor, and specifically the warning labels on the sun visor. These are common. These are on virtually every car. Airbag warning label and various other warning labels. The interesting thing about this particular car is you can remove them. You don't want to look at your warning labels. You just slide your hand in there and you can just pull them right out, and then your sun visor is warning label-less. Sort of optional warning labels in this vehicle. Next up, moving back to the center console, and specifically the center storage box. If you open up the lid for that little storage box and look on the underside of the lid, you will see a little storage compartment on the underside of the lid itself, but it isn't just any storage compartment, it is labeled tissue. You must place tissues there. That's what it's for. Interestingly, it's sized in a way I've never seen any tissue box or tissue dispenser this size, but nonetheless, that's where you put tissues if you have a 4Runner. Also in the center console, I want to bring up the gear selector. Now, the gear selector in this thing is just massive, and it's very heavy. You kind of move it into gear and you really feel like you've accomplished something. It's a very large thing. It looks like a 1980s cell phone. Maybe more unusual, something I've never mentioned before, but I really should have. Why does Toyota still have these gear patterns in their automatic transmissions? Seriously, you have to move it over from park and then to the left for reverse and to the left for neutral and to the left for drive. Is it so you don't accidentally stick it in the wrong gear or something? And if so, I mean, nobody else is doing this. Maybe it's time for Toyota to think about just a straight little line. Make it easier on everybody. And next up, moving on to the sun visors. Now, when you drop the sun visors, you will see that they have this little retractable plastic piece that's on there so that when you put the sun visor over on your left or on the right on the passenger side, you can block out all the sun coming through the side window, and that makes sense. But personally, I think there's another purpose for it, namely a duel. Next up, moving on to the center touchscreen. Usually I go through these and find a bunch of quirks, but this one is so small that its functions are so limited, there's not really any interesting quirks or features in there. It only does a few basic things. One interesting item that it does allow, you can customize the image that comes on when you start up your 4Runner, and you can customize the image that comes on if you have the screen off. Like if you don't want to see anything displayed, you could put a picture of your kids there, or your dog, instead of just sort of having a picture like some people do, and that is kind of a cool idea. Next, we move on to the back seats, although there's really nothing interesting back here. It's pretty simple. There's no screen or anything. There's fairly standard back seats. When you drop this, you get 2 cup holders. You can pull out the insert and then you have the larger cup holder. In terms of rear seat room, it's pretty standard, pretty roomy, like most mid-size SUVs, including Toyota's own Highlander. With that said, the Highlander comes standard with a 3rd row. You can't get a 3rd row seat in the 4Runner TRD Pro, which is one of many reasons why the Highlander is more practical than the TRD Pro. Now, next up, moving around back, take a look back here and you'll notice that the rear window is partially down, and this leads us to, in my opinion, the 4Runner's coolest feature. Ever since the 4Runner became a vehicle 30 plus years ago, it's had a roll down rear window. You push a little button in the center console marked auto, and then the window can roll down just like any one of the side windows in any normal car. I guess the theory is it provides additional airflow throughout the cabin. You roll it down, roll down the windows, and you sort of get a great breeze in there. Pets obviously love it. If you have a dog back there or maybe a baby tapir, it'll really enjoy its experience in the cargo area. One interesting thing about the rear window, if you lower it even a little bit, just slightly, it locks out the rear wiper from working. Just drop it down an inch and the rear wiper won't turn on. It has a lockout. It knows when the window is down, so you can't turn on the wiper and just have it sort of wiping air, which is unfortunate because I would love to be able to show that to you. Now, one other cool thing about that back window opening is that you can walk up to the back of your 4Runner, put the key in the tailgate, turn it, and then the rear window drops. And that way, if you don't want to open the entire tailgate, you're just putting some small item in, you can do that without opening the whole thing. You want to close the window again, you just turn the key the other way and it closes right up, and that is pretty cool. It's also worth noting that even if you put the window down, you can still open the tailgate, which of course is not a power tailgate, and then you are treated to the cargo area. Now, once you're in the cargo area, there's really nothing interesting back here. It's just an area for cargo. It's reasonably large. There is one interesting item. There's a power outlet back here, and you can turn it on with a little button next to the steering wheel up front. You push it, and then it sends power to that outlet, and you can turn it on. You open up the power outlet, and it specifically says, notice, close this lid when not in use. And since I'm not using this power outlet right now, I guess I better close that up. Next up, moving on to the outside, you will see that there's this little bar that goes across the entire side of the 4Runner. The owner tells me it's not really a rock slider. Instead, it appears to be a mounting point for these side steps. On the window sticker, Toyota calls these the Predator side steps, and they charge $649 extra for them. This vehicle is not lifted to the point where it really needs side steps, but you gotta admit it does give it kind of a cool look. Now, something that gives the truck a little less of a cool look is the front end design. Now, I love that it says Toyota across the front, like the old Land Cruisers, like a real work vehicle, but I've never really understood this front fascia design. What are these things? They look like sort of weird nostrils on the side of the grille. I think this is a great example of over-styling, and it's the only part of the truck's exterior design that I don't really like all that much. Next up, we have to discuss the 4Runner TRD Pro's off-roading credentials, which are actually pretty good. This thing is more than just an appearance package. It actually has a lot of cool off-road stuff. It has a 4-wheel drive, obviously. It also has 4-wheel drive low range gearing for better off-roading capabilities. It has a rear locking differential, which will help it get out of situations where it might be stuck. More importantly, it has crawl control, which is just the coolest thing in the world. I demonstrated it on my Toyota Land Cruiser video, which I'm linking below, but basically you can just set crawl control, and it's like off-roading cruise control, and it'll crawl over things at a desired speed and do exactly what it needs to get over obstacles. It's a crazy feature. It also has that terrain select I showed you earlier, where it can go over moguls if you tell it to. And then there's the hardware on the outside. This truck is lifted by an inch compared to the standard 4Runner. It also has Fox off-roading shocks, which gives it better wheel travel when you're off-roading, you're going over boulders or something. There's more space for the wheel to sort of retreat into the wheel arch so you can clear stuff. It also obviously has a giant front skid plate, and these wheels, these cool off-roading wheels, are coated in black rather than like aluminum alloy wheels, which will get damaged or scratched if you're a serious off-roader. Obviously, in the same vein of the wheels, it also has these sort of off-roading mud tires so that it can take the off-roading obstacles a lot better than your traditional street tires would. And so that's a tour of one of the coolest new SUVs on the road. Now it's time to take it for a drive. All right, driving the TRD Pro 4Runner. I got to admit, I've kind of wanted to drive one of these ever since it came out. I love the look of this thing. And the other thing I think about the 4Runner that's kind of interesting is a lot of people lament that the Land Cruiser has gotten tremendously expensive. You know, it's still the great off-roader that it used to be, but no one can afford it anymore. Well, this is the Land Cruiser now. It's sort of a bare bones, stripped down, you know, not high featured truck. And yeah, it's also pretty expensive, but it's not 85 grand like the Land Cruiser. This is your Land Cruiser, and the TRD Pro one specifically. This is a 60 series Land Cruiser for the modern time. Now, I think one big question that a lot of people are going to ask about this particular truck is, you know, how is it to drive daily? I mean, I don't take these things off-road in these reviews, but the thing is, most people don't. And so you want to know what it's like to drive around your suburb. That's where you're going to be 95% of the time. And the answer is the ride is incredibly smooth. It blows me away. You know, you got these Nitto grappler tires. You'd think you'd hear them, it would kind of make it a little bit rough. It doesn't. But I was expecting it to be like a Jeep with off-roader tires where, you know, just driving along, it's like really terrible. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's more refined than I was expecting. I certainly wouldn't consider it to be an ultra refined modern vehicle. When I look down at the gauge cluster, that black and white screen is insane on a car this expensive in 2018. That's wild. But everything else, I mean, yeah, you know, there's some, you make some sacrifices here or there with no blind spot monitor, that kind of stuff. But you got to figure who's buying this truck kind of knows this is the vehicle you get if you really want just a reliable, simple off-roader type vehicle. Now, they're selling 130,000 of these a year. I bet a lot of people are buying it and want more than that and are disappointed, or I can't believe it doesn't have this. Well, that's not the point of the truck. All right, I'm gonna give it a little gas here. Well, it makes some noise. I've got the back open. It's not what I would call quick. It's certainly good enough to get up to highway speeds. It's get up, you know, on ramp, whatever. I consider the biggest competitor to the 4Runner to be the Jeep Wrangler, even though they're very different. They're now both 4 doors, mostly in the Wrangler's case. The Wrangler's getting more expensive, the 4Runner's getting more expensive. They're both kind of off-roader, cool-looking SUVs. The new Wrangler is excellent on the road, but this is still better. It's, you know, it feels more insulated, it feels more substantial, more solid. I think the Wrangler is now ahead of this in features, which is crazy. What would stop me from getting it is the safety tech. I just, you know, it's an older design and it's just so low on like modern safety stuff. For $50, if I was buying a new car, I mean, you know, you can get a Volvo XC60, you can get a Mercedes GLC, and it has all that stuff. However, you know, it doesn't have the off-roady, it doesn't have the attitude. The 129,000 people who bought this thing last year, they don't want a stupid GLC. That's a boring blend-in suburb car. This is a cool, blue, in-your-face off-roader, and it can really tackle the trails. So that's the 4Runner TRD Pro. 50 grand is a lot of money for this old-school SUV. And admittedly, you can get them cheaper than that. They start around 44, but with options and extras, it's easy to get them up to 48, 49, 50, and even above. Is it worth it? Well, this thing is pretty old school, but the thing is, these days everyone has a crossover or an SUV, so you're no longer cool if you get one, and you certainly no longer have any ability to go off-roading. If you want to take to the trails, and if you want to stand out with something a little different, a little more distinctive, a little cooler, well, then you have to get a TRD Pro. And now it's time to give it a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I love how the TRD Pro looks. It's not a beautiful sports car, but it's handsome, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration, it does 0 to 60 in 8 seconds, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is only fine. It's a big SUV, and it lumbers along, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor is mixed. I'm sure it's fun off the pavement, but it's not very exciting on the road. In fact, the owner of this truck had a BMW before and traded in this 4Runner on a Golf R just a few days after I filmed this video because he wanted to have more fun. It's just a bit dull driving normally, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Cool factor is reasonably high for a midsize SUV, especially in this color, and it gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 21 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's surprisingly low on features, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Comfort is fine, not special, but not bad, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Quality is very high in terms of reliability and durability, but materials aren't especially nice, and it gets only a 7 out of 10. Practicality is good. It has a roomy interior, but fuel economy drops it down to a 9 out of 10.
Finally, there's value. This is a tough one because the 4Runner is vastly overpriced, but it also holds its value really well. So even if you pay too much to get one, you get a lot of it back when you go to sell it. With that in mind, it gets a 6 out of 10, bringing the total daily score to 32 out of 50. Add it up, and the Doug score is 53 out of 100. And here's a comparison against other off-roaders. The new 2018 JL Wrangler beats it out. The Jeep is more fun on the weekend, and while it loses to the 4Runner in the daily categories, it isn't by much, as the new Wrangler is way more refined and better equipped than ever before.